Hi, guys, and welcome to this episode of the Happy Knitting Podcast. My name is Julia, and I'm coming to you as always from the south of Germany. Today is Thursday, it's the 9th of April 2020, and I'm so happy that you are joining me today. If you're a new viewer, today is a special episode, so if you're looking for more of the regular podcast content, in which I show what I'm working on, what I finished, what yarn I have maybe acquired. This is not the episode for you. Maybe just go back a couple and look for one of those episodes that has a number attached to it. And maybe that will be more helpful. But if you do want to stick around today to listen to me basically just chat, then of course you're welcome to do so. So thanks to anyone who is watching. I will warn you today in advance that this is probably the least prepared I've ever been for an episode, which says a lot because I'm usually not that prepared anyhow. But I wasn't going to record a special episode this week, and then I thought, well, maybe I should, and I have a couple of questions that I've been asked. So I just thought I would chat about these things. These are all kind of knitting related topics, and if you've watched any of my question and answers videos before, you will know that I am not the most eloquent about answering these things. But I thought I would just chat to you guys about a couple of things. And if you're one of those people who have been watching for 4 or 5 years, then maybe some of this I've already talked about, but I don't expect anyone to go back that far. So if I'm telling you anything that I've told you before, then I'm sorry, you can just skip and I will see you next time. So where do we start? I'm looking down because I have my laptop down there with a couple of questions that I got after my last Q&A video. So I will just run through those pretty quickly. I have not really thought about them too hard because I like to keep things spontaneous. And then I will regret that during editing when I see myself talking absolute rubbish. But here we are. So let's just jump right in. First questions. What are your favorite colors to knit and to wear? So that is a difficult question because I love to knit all the colors. If we're talking about garments, I have talked about in the past how my color palette has changed a little bit. So I used to be very much on the cold colors. I love and still love, the pinks and the grays and the sometimes even I used to like steely blues and all the really cool tones. And within the last year or so, I've really started embracing warmer colors as well, more like an autumnal palette. And yeah, I like a lot of colors, it seems. I was washing most of my sweaters today, and while I do have a selection of like pink and mauve and purple sweaters, I have a lot of gray, and then I also have like the odd yellow sweater and the odd orange sweater, and it seems that I like a lot of colors. The only color where I don't think I have any sweaters in is actually green. At least I can't really remember knitting anything like very green, even though I do like the sort of moss, I guess, green or forest green that you see sometimes. And I do have quite a bit of green yarn in my stash. I mean, not a lot, but I do have a couple of sweater quantities, and I especially like the sort of mustardy green that you get sometimes. And I do want to actually knit myself a couple of more, I don't want to say summery sweaters, but lighter sweaters. I have some yarn in stash by PC Garn in sort of like an olive green, and that's something I would like to explore. I also don't usually knit with brown or black yarn, partly because I just love color too much, and partly because those are hard colors to knit. But again, I have, I think, at least one charcoal sweater quantity in my stash, and I would love to have a really simple charcoal, maybe even a cardigan to just throw over. So I do want to knit that up sometime soon, but I know it will be quite hard on the eyes to knit on that, so I haven't done that yet. I should probably do that now that we are going into spring and summer and we have much more light, and it will be a lot easier to work on those things. On the topic of color, when it comes to knitting socks and shawls, I love to knit all the colors in the world, and I'm really happy that I can also knit for my husband because he likes very crazy colors, and some of these colors I would not necessarily wear anywhere on my body except maybe my feet. But because he loves all the colors and all the neons and greens and yellows and all the bright colors, I think it's really fun to knit colorful socks. And I would basically knit anything in terms of sock yarn. I think there's no real color that I haven't knit socks out of, and I actually really enjoy that aspect of socks, that you can just experiment with things. And I know that there are some people who wouldn't wear rainbow socks, but I absolutely do, and I'm very happy about that. Even when I was working more in a corporate setting than I do these days, because these days I'm working from home. I would do, a pretty sort of smart casual work wardrobe with like blazers and shirts and stuff, but I still loved sneaking in a colorful sock. It's not like anyone really noticed. So while at least for work I dressed kind of conservatively, not super conservatively, but I wouldn't be able to wear colorful knit sweaters or anything. I would mostly just wear like grays and blues and blacks and all of that. A pair of colorful socks makes me very, very happy. Next question. Do you ever make sweaters you hate, or are you overly critical of your knitwear? And the person who asked that question said that she was quite critical of her own knitwear a lot of the time. It's a difficult question. I am not someone who typically dwells on making sweaters or having made sweaters that don't fit perfectly. I tend to just kind of accept them. So my sweaters surely often aren't perfect, and a lot of times I know that if I maybe went back and lengthened the body of something, it would be more perfect, I should say. But I tend to kind of go with what I make, and once things are done, they're just done, and I will wear them, and I don't really care that much. Part of that is that most of my sweaters don't use crazy expensive yarn, so I don't feel like I've wasted anything. And I'm usually happy to give away sweaters that maybe don't fit or I just don't end up wearing that much. There are very few sweater quantities in my stash or in my sweaters where I am too precious about them. So for example, you may remember I finished a yellow sweater, the line of shapes sweater quite recently, and that was just too small. Like, I started that in November, and then I didn't finish it for a while, and I also got pregnant, and I think it was already too small when I started it, and it definitely was too small when I finished it. And what I did today is I actually washed all of my sweaters, and while it made the yarn a lot softer, it did not exactly make the sweater bigger. I think, if anything, it is even smaller now. But I tend to just kind of go along with these things. I know I can always knit more, and again, most of the time I will find someone who will like those sweaters. So I don't really lose a lot of sleep over it. I think it has to do with the fact that I'm more a process than a product knitter. So I generally just really enjoy the process of making things, or even picking yarns and picking patterns and figuring stuff out. And I probably enjoy that more than the finished garments. If you are someone who is very critical, I think part of it is to just accept that things are handmade and they don't need to be perfect. None of my sweaters or garments are perfect. There's often small mistakes in there, and it's fine. I will, however, say that if you notice something that is obvious to you, for example, on a cabled sweater, maybe you've twisted the wrong way, if you know that you're going to be critical about it, sometimes it is better to go back on things. I don't tend to think back a lot, but I know lots of people who do, and I think sometimes it's better to go back and redo something, and then you'll be happy with it, rather than finishing a garment that takes you hours and hours of knitting, only to, in the end, kind of admit to yourself that because of that small mistake that you made, you don't really like the garment and you will always notice that mistake. So I think it's very much up to you, but I tend to not be very perfectionist about these things when it comes to my knitting. Next question. Do you knit your socks toe up or cuff down? I do both, but I would always consider myself a cuff down knitter because that is what I do most of the time. That is how I learned to knit socks, and it is still my preferred way. There's no right or wrong way. Whatever is your preferred way is absolutely fine. I'm not judging. I just prefer cuff down because I am very particular about basically the opening or the very top of your cuff of your sock. And I find that when I cast on with my usual German longtail cast on, I just get the perfect edge that is super stretchy but still looks nice even when you're not wearing the socks. And when you're doing toe up socks, you have to obviously bind off at that point, and I find it much harder to get like a perfect bind off. That being said, the reason why I sometimes do knit toe up socks is sometimes I just like to mix it up. And more often I like to knit my socks two at a time, and you can do that both ways, obviously. I used to knit my socks two at a time, cuff down, and I would do one cuff and then the second cuff and then only join them together as a two at a time pair of socks. These days I have figured out how to start without having to use separate needles and knitting separate cuffs, so either way I can cast on and go straight into my two at a time knitting. But I do find that actually toe up is easier for that, and also a good reason to do toe up for me is if I'm using, for example, hand spun yarn where I don't necessarily know yet if I need 64 stitches or 60 stitches or 56 stitches. It is easier to do a toe up sock for me because then you can just kind of, you start with a couple of stitches and you increase, and then you can just see if at whatever number of stitches you're at, that looks like a good circumference of your sock. So I find that quite handy. So yeah, I think there are advantages and disadvantages to both methods. I probably would always prefer cuff down, but I really like both ways, and I think only once have I actually knit a pair where I did one sock cuff down and one toe up, and that was quite fun as well. And depending on the heel that you use, for example, I like to use short row heels such as the Fish Lips Kiss heel. That works the same whether you're doing toe up or cuff down, so you can just interchange those and it will be fine. The next question was a really, really difficult one because it was, what is your favorite sweater that you have knit? And I mean, I'm not asking you to choose between your kids, which one is your favorite, am I? I really cannot tell you that. I have quite a lot of sweaters that I really enjoy wearing, and I have made 2 sweater episodes, which I will try to link below the video. And in those I talk about some of my sweaters, some of which I really like, some of them maybe I don't like so much. So that is definitely something you could check out if you're interested in that. For me, a perfect sweater is kind of the combination of the perfect yarn and pattern and fit. And that doesn't have to mean it needs to be an expensive yarn. It just means that sometimes these 3 things just come together, and maybe I choose a color that is very wearable and I just end up wearing stuff all the time. I have brought one sweater to show you, but it's really just one of my many sweaters that I like. And I'm sitting on it, which helps. I've talked about this in the past. This is the Emma Yoke pullover, which is a pattern by Knit for Passion. Is it? I am so sorry. Her real name is Astrid Tüting, and she's actually in Munich, and I've met her before. So if you're watching, Astrid, hi. I knit this quite a while ago, and while I'm showing this to you, this sweater is actually still slightly damp. But this is one of those sweaters where everything just kind of came together. So it is a top-down yoke pullover. This one actually has different charts for different sizes, which I think is very, very cool because we're all about size inclusivity, but that does mean that if you just have one yoke chart, it will look very different depending on what size you knit. But this one has quite a few, I think, different yoke charts, which was awesome. So I knit this top down. As you can tell, it has color work, which I love, and then it is just kind of like a light boxy sweater. As per usual, I kind of did my own thing with the sleeve decreases, the body decreases, and all of that. And the yarn that I used for this is a Danish yarn called Black Hill Wool by Garnet Salk, which is a Danish website. I order from them because it's quite affordable and they have really nice yarn, but at the same time you have to use Google Translate, and it's always a bit of an adventure because I never really know what I'm ordering. But I would liken this to Hold Super Soft, JC Rennie, those sort of yarns. But this one is definitely my favorite because it is crazy light. Like all of these yarns are, I don't know, maybe it's like 500 or 550 meters per 100 grams. But it is a non-superwash woolen spun yarn, and this just fluffs up so much in the best possible way. So while I didn't even enjoy knitting with it so much, just from wearing this, I think over the last 1.5 years, and washing it, this has become super soft and squishy and very light. I'm not sure if you can tell, but it just forms this texture which is really amazing. So this is a very high favorite amongst all of my sweaters, and you will notice this yoke is colorful, so it's not even the most sort of practical thing to wear. I don't wear this out a lot, but it is just a very light sweater. It is non-superwash yarn, which I'll talk about in a second, but some of the advantages are that it is very light, it is keeping you quite warm, but it's not a yarn that makes you like sweat and overheat. So this is definitely one of my favorites. And yeah, I just washed this today and I was going to put away my winter sweaters. So I washed all of my sort of very thick, warm, heavyweight sweaters to then put away in a vacuum bag over summer. And I was going to put this one away as well, but now just looking at it, maybe I'll keep it out because I love it so much. So that is my Emma yoke. Next up is the question that I've already kind of teased, which is, why do you prefer knitting sweaters with non-superwash yarn? Are there any advantages? And this is a topic that I'll probably linger on for a while. I thought about making a separate episode on this, but again, I just haven't really had the time to think about it super hard, so I thought I'd chat about it today. So when we talk about superwash and non-superwash yarns, I know that there are many people that have different opinions. There are people who generally only use yarns that are non-superwash, and usually also yarns that don't contain any nylon because of the ecological advantages of those yarns, and just wanting to reduce like use of plastic and wanting to have biodegradable yarns and just generally products in their life. And then there are people who love superwash, and I don't want to polarize because I think both options are okay, and whatever you choose is your opinion, so I don't want to polarize too much on that. I do a mix of both. So generally I like the idea of non-superwash yarns and I love knitting sweaters with it. I'll go more into that in a second. But as you'll probably know, I also sometimes knit with non-superwash yarn, and I knit a lot of socks, which usually, not exclusively, but usually are also out of superwash yarns. So most of the yarn that you can buy that is, for example, indie dyed, will have a superwash coating. I won't go into the details because I will probably get it wrong, but I think the advantages are that it is easier to dye and you get those really vibrant colors, and especially for sock yarns and such, it is really fun to have those. There's also obviously the advantage of superwash, which makes you think that you can just wash that very easily. And while I also just machine wash non-superwash yarns, and I will talk about that in a second, I get the advantage. So while I know how to wash non-superwash things in a machine, I probably wouldn't gift any knitwear to people who don't knit. Especially like if I were to make baby knits for someone else's baby, I would probably use superwash because not everyone has the time or the brain space or whatever to deal with non-superwash, and it definitely has its advantages. Now, why do I like non-superwash yarns? There are several reasons. I've already talked about, of course, the sort of environmental advantage of using natural products. I'm also a spinner, and I generally really like the sort of sheepy aspect of yarn or our craft in general. So I like learning about and using different sheep breeds. I like to use yarns that are not just your typical merino, which is mostly sourced from Australia, New Zealand, and sometimes also South America. I also like the sort of sheepiness and the sheepy smell and the feeling of non-superwash yarn. And there are a couple of advantages, or at least for me personally, when it comes to especially knitting garments. So the first advantage is that whereas superwash yarn, sometimes it feels really nice, sometimes it feels a bit, I don't want to say plasticky, but you can kind of feel that it's not a very natural product. Non-superwash yarn is obviously much closer to the wool that comes from the sheep. And I like that aspect of it. I do like soft yarn every now and then, but I don't need all of my yarn to be super soft. A lot of the times, yarns can be very, very different to different people. So some people are very, very sensitive and stuff feels itchy to them. And some people, like myself, are not that sensitive. And I think maybe it's also partly getting used to non-superwash yarns. And again, there are many, many different non-superwash yarns out there. So some of them are definitely softer than others. There's lamb's wool. And then there are yarns like Shetland and Gotland, and those can be a bit harsher. And again, it also depends on how is that yarn processed. So how is it spun? How is it plied? There's even a non-superwash singles yarn out there, which feels really nice. And I like to experiment with those things. Then there's also worsted and woolen spun. So I'm getting very technical here. Indulge me for a second. So try to keep it simple. A worsted spun yarn means that it is not a weight. There is a worsted weight, but it doesn't have anything to do with worsted spun yarn. So in the worsted spun yarn, the fibers are basically flattened, so they all go into one direction, and it makes for a sort of shiny and less fuzzy yarn than a woolen spun yarn. So a woolen spun yarn, the fibers are going basically in any direction. The fiber or the finished yarn doesn't look as shiny, it's more of a fluffy sort of feeling. And using a non-superwash woolen spun yarn means that the fibers, when you work with them and you maybe do color work and you wash them, they kind of all interlock together and stick together, which makes for a really interesting effect. Also, because those woolen spun yarns, they are not as compressed, the fibers are basically still containing a lot of air between them. They tend to be a bit lighter, so a lot of the woolen spun yarns, such as Jamieson and Smith, Jamieson of Shetland, there are so many woolen spun yarns, and I can't think of any examples right now, but a lot of them, they tend to be yarns where you get quite a bit of yardage. You can knit them at a variety of gauges because they tend to just adapt to a lot of different gauges. So you can knit, I don't know, Jamieson and Smith 2-ply jumper weight. You can knit that at a very tight fingering weight gauge. You can knit that at a sport weight to DK weight gauge, possibly even larger than that, and it will adapt. Because of that, also because of the properties of that yarn, non-superwash yarns, and especially woolen spun non-superwash yarns, they tend to basically give you a lighter garment. So if I were to knit a DK weight superwash yarn, I would need a lot of yarn, probably like 500 grams, and it would be a very heavy garment. And being a heavy garment doesn't have to be a bad thing, but it usually means that your garment will then stretch out from its own weight. And just generally, superwash yarns, they will stretch out more with blocking than your non-superwash yarns will. So I just like the properties of non-superwash yarns. Another advantage is, like I said, when you do color work, it is much easier to get a nice fabric where your color work just kind of melds together, so you don't have that problem of single stitches sticking out or catching your floats, or you don't have to secure your steeks with a sewing machine, because the yarn basically just sticks to itself. So in this example, this is Drops Flora, which is actually a wool and alpaca blend, but it's a non-superwash yarn. By the way, I just threw this in the machine and it was fine. But you can see that this color work, you can't really separate the stitches anymore. And when you look on the inside, it is all just kind of melted together. All the colors, all the yarns are staying where they are. You don't really have to worry about the color work looking too even, because this yarn just lends itself to color work. And you can see here there's like a flea motif or lice pattern on the entire body of the sweater, but it all kind of blends together and makes a really unifying fabric, which is really, really awesome for color work, which I like to do. So that's another advantage. And like I said, if you do want to steek your garments, especially if you're using a woolen spun non-superwash yarn, it just doesn't tend to unravel. So once you cut your knitting, I mean, what I tend to do is I tend to reinforce a little bit, but you don't even necessarily have to do that, but you definitely don't have to like use a sewing machine to fix your stitches or anything. The stitches basically just stay where you want them to stay, and it makes it really easy. Lastly, the properties of non-superwash yarns. I mean, people have been using wool and non-superwash wool for a really, really, really long time, and the advantages are that you can basically wear it and it's really good at regulating your body temperature. So even very lightweight garments out of non-superwash yarn will keep you very warm, but at the same time they don't make you like overheat. You don't get super sweaty, and wool actually has self-cleaning properties. So you don't need to wash your non-superwash garments that often at all. I don't wash my hand knits very often at all, because it basically cleans itself. And the best thing you can do for it is to hang your sweater or your garment out of non-superwash yarn outside, maybe even in the rain, like obviously not in the rain, but when it's a sort of humid day, or I just hang my stuff on the balcony, it basically just cleans itself. So those are all properties of non-superwash yarn, which I really find very appealing to myself, to my taste. So that is why I tend to use them. Again, I don't always use them. I have superwash sweaters as well, but I don't know. I just really like non-superwash yarn. Like, it gives you that sort of sheepy smell and feel, and I find that I wear them most because they're just the most comfortable thing for me to wear. I've already kind of teased about using washing non-superwash yarns, and this is just my own personal experience, so please don't go put your non-superwash yarns in the washer and dryer just based on my experience. I am not responsible for what happens to your garments, but generally speaking, just because a yarn is non-superwash doesn't mean you have to hand wash it. So for example, I tend to wash most things in my washing machine. And what I will do is, like this morning, I threw about 15 sweaters of mine in the washing machine, including this one, which is non-superwash. And I throw it on a cold wash. I try to use the wool washing powder. Sorry. And it is really important to, besides regulating the temperature, to also regulate the spinning speed. So your washing machine will also, do a spin cycle in the end, and you want that to be either very fast or very slow. If you just I usually use the highest setting these days. I have changed that from when I used to wash my sweaters a couple of months ago. Now I always use the highest setting. And then when you watch your sweaters spin, or your non-superwash garments in general, they will just kind of stick to the outside of your washing machine. And once they come out, they're really, really quite dry already. And nothing happens to them. Something happens when you agitate your garments, and that can happen whether you're washing them in the machine or whether you're washing them in your sink. And it also happens when you have, very cold water and very hot water and all these things at the same time. But I just throw them in the washing machine. I usually use the 15 degree Celsius setting because that is the coldest setting that my washing machine has, and they're fine. I will say that, again, it really depends on your yarn. I have even washed non-superwash sock yarn socks at 30 degrees. There is the sock yarn by Rosa Pomar, which is a non-superwash sock yarn. I just threw them in and they were fine. But I also have a friend who did the same thing and they weren't fine. So maybe it also depends on your machine. You kind of need to know what you're doing with your washing machine. But it works for me. So what I do is with these superwash and non-superwash garments is I pretty much wear them all the time, air them out as much as I possibly can. So I don't wash them very often. And then like today, I decided it's quite warm now, and even though it might get a bit colder again at some point, I probably won't need my quote-unquote winter sweater, or my winter sweaters and winter jackets and cardigans and all of that for now. So I did wash all of them, or almost all of them. They're currently drying outside in the sun because it is quite warm today. And once they're all clean and washed, I will put them in a vacuum sealed bag and I will seal it for the summer, and they will be safe and I don't have to worry about them. So there's nothing wrong with, keeping your hand knits storage open somewhere. That's what I do with some of my garments, but the ones that I know that I'm not going to wear for a couple of months, for example, my Let Lopi sweaters, my Jamieson Smith sweaters, I will just put them away. And I'm also putting away a couple that just don't fit me anymore right now because I am pregnant, but maybe they will fit again. So I'm just putting those away, and then those are safe. And the sweaters that are left in my wardrobe are the ones that will actually be worn more throughout summer anyways. So yeah, that is what I tend to do. And yeah, there we are. That was a very, very long talk about non-superwash yarns. I'm sure I forgot some aspects, and I'm sorry if I did. Again, it's very much a personal choice, and I am not here to judge. I am knitting a superwash sweater right now out of hedgehog fibers yarn, and I think all yarn kind of has its place. So there are some instances in which I really like a superwash, colorful, speckled sweater, and I will knit that as well. And then there are other instances where I just prefer the sort of woolly, more sort of, I don't want to say traditional garments because that makes it sound weird, but yeah, I just like both really. And in terms of knitting with both yarns or both types of yarns, I find it really depends on the yarn. So there are some superwash yarns that I don't like knitting with. There are some superwash yarns that I love knitting with, and the same applies for non-superwash yarns. So I think it just really depends on what you use. And obviously I talked about both categories very, very broadly, and it really just depends. There are so many different yarns and spinning techniques and processing techniques out there. So it really just depends on what you like and what yarn you use. And maybe final word that I haven't mentioned yet, obviously, I try and aim to never use yarn that's been mulesed. I can't pronounce that word, but mulesing free yarn is really, really important to me. It is, I think, only done on merino sheep. And it's just a really terrible practice. So most dyers will tell you on their websites if the bases that they are using are mulesing free, and I think most of the higher quality yarns these days are, but it is something to look out for. All right. Next up, And I only have 2 more very quick questions if you're worried. What are some of your favorite Disney films? And I am going to disappoint you very, very terribly because I am that child who grew up without Disney films. Like, I literally cannot even remember if I ever have seen a Disney film. I mean, surely I must have, but I don't really remember. So that is a very quick question and a very sad answer. And I know one day I will get into Disney movies, and it should be really fun because I have all of that to look forward to, but no answer today. And related to that, maybe, have you ever knit anything inspired by one of your favorite fandoms? So I thought about that quite hard, and I haven't in the most typical way. So I haven't ever like seen something in a series and knit the exact same thing. I have, however, watched things where I've noticed knitwear that is really gorgeous. Orphan Black, by the way, has really nice knitwear and I really like it. I have used yarn, mostly like self-striping yarn and sock yarns that is named based on fandoms. I know that Sabrina of Das Mondschaf, she has some amazing colorway names, and I have been tempted many times to buy things just based on those colorway names. There's some Breaking Bad colorways, which I love, and I love Breaking Bad. She had Alien colorways, she had House colorways. I think she does a lot of Game of Thrones, which I watched a couple of seasons, but not all of them. But I have occasionally knit with yarn that had a sort of fandom-inspired colorway. And besides that, I think that some of my favorite fandoms, such as, for example, Gilmore Girls, have inspired me, but more in a subtle way. So while I haven't really looked at any of the episodes and thought I need to knit the exact same thing, I know that, for example, in Gilmore Girls, there's quite a bit of nice knitwear, and there are a couple of sort of traditional cabled sweaters, and I've knit a couple of those. So I think those things, they do influence me, but not in the most obvious way. So I'm not sure if that is a satisfying answer to your question, but there you go. So that is it for the questions for today, and I just feel like I just babbled very, very randomly. Also today I didn't have any knitting to work on while talking to you because I just didn't have any projects that kind of worked for knitting mindlessly while talking to you and making at least some kind of sense. But still, I hope that this was somewhat interesting to you. I have been getting so much feedback recently on my episodes that are basically just designed to help you guys and help all of us pass this time and get through this and have some sort of distraction from what's going on in the world. So I really just from the bottom of my heart hope that maybe this small rant and babble and just ramble about knitting has brought you a little bit of joy and inspiration. And again, these are just my personal views on things, probably not elaborated very nicely, but I hope that it was interesting to you. Of course, I'm interested in what you guys think, and if you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask them, and maybe I will have time to answer them in another episode. So this is it for today. I will be back on the weekend with another sort of more normal episode with finished objects and works in progress and some new yarn. So I hope until then you have a great couple of days. Happy Easter if you're celebrating. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Every time I say this, I kind of stumble over that, and I want to stay healthy. No, that's not a word. Safe and healthy. And I will see you very, very soon. Thanks for watching. Happy knitting. Bye.